Our next presenter in our session is Emma Radisch. Emma is a double major in environmental studies and history, graduating in June of 2022. A couple weeks from now. Now, I've learned through my yellow clipboard that Emma is a skier, but she's no ski bum. She's president of the RCO and nonprofit organization Husky Winter Sports that offers accessible snow sports to UW students, so that's very cool. She plans on, I think, doing a little bit of ski bumming after graduation. The title of her presentation today is Online Learning, Best Practices for Environmental Science Webinars with Alaska Native Communities. She worked with NOAA's Alaska Fisheries Science Center as part of her internship, where her site supervisor was Lisa Haruki Raring, and her faculty advisor from here on campus was Professor Dawn Hardison Stevens in the College of Education and the Department of American Indian Studies. Without further ado, let's turn it over to Emma.
All right, can you guys hear me okay on the mic? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen our already incredibly online world take a turn further into the virtual. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the amazing opportunities for environmental education that remote learning has to offer. And no, I'm not just talking about how you can go to class from your bed. Today, we're going to be talking about webinars. Webinars are a great tool for environmental education because they're easily accessible, they create a reusable learning source, and they're accessible to people all over the world, including people in rural and remote communities. For my Capstone internship, I worked with the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center on their webinar series, NOAA Live Alaska. This series is aimed at sharing environmental topics in Alaska with grades 2 through 8, but is open for anyone to register. My research question for my capstone is, what are the best practices for environmental science webinars working with remote Alaska Native communities? My team specifically looked at the ways that we could increase our outreach, engagement, and accessibility for these communities in this season of NOAA Live Alaska. The ways that I collected my results for this research question was learning from our experiences hosting and facilitating weekly webinars, conducting my own independent literature research, as well as conducting 8 interviews with educators in Alaska that had been to our webinars. On this map here, you can see all of the locations of our interviewees, whether they were working there or are from there originally, and all of the places in red are places off the road system, which is a pretty unique remote kind of place for Alaska where it's only accessible by boat, plane, or snow machine in the winter. And you can also see down here where Seattle is, where we were hosting the webinars, so it's pretty far. And this is a really important distinction for these communities because they're remote, have a high concentration of Alaska Native populations, and they're perfect for webinars since they're far away. The 3 main themes that my results fell under are the importance of building a long-term relationship with your community, adapting the technology we used to that community, and then also making sure to incorporate culturally responsive teaching into every one of our webinars. For Alaska Native peoples, there's a very recent history of settler colonial education being used as a tool for cultural genocide. Because of this, before doing any sort of educational work with these communities, we have to make sure to build a relationship on trust. It's also really important for these communities, since they're remote, to adapt to the type of internet and computer access that they have there, since it can be really a lot more limited than what we're used to in big cities like Seattle. And lastly, it's really important to include culturally responsive teaching in every single aspect of our webinar. And culturally responsive teaching is an educator's ability to adapt to each student's different learning styles and cultural backgrounds, working with those instead of against it. So to start off, we're going to talk about how to incorporate each of these main themes into every step of the webinar process, from preparation, advertising, webinar, and post-webinar. Starting off with the preparation phase, during this, we're making sure we're recruiting speakers and getting everything settled, set up, in order so we have a good webinar to show. And one way that we increased our outreach to Alaska Native communities with this was to recruit a speaker from those target communities. So we would reach out to people that lived in the communities we were trying to give environmental education programs to. This is one example of that with Lance Kramer, who shared his subsistence lifestyles. And here you can see the seal that they would hunt, braid the intestines, and then dry out the blubber. And these practices were really important and resonated well with Alaska Native audiences. For the advertising phase, we wanted to make sure everything looks good on both a computer and a mobile device to increase accessibility for Alaska Native communities. This is because if we think back to that map that we looked at earlier, all of those places in red with fairly limited computer and internet access, many people in them choose to use their smartphone as their main computer because of cost barriers or access barriers. And then you can see one example, a screenshot of our recording, and it looks great on a phone, which is great for everyone. And then for our actual webinar, we wanted to make sure to increase engagement from our Alaska Native students, that we facilitated conversations that connected Alaska Native culture directly to STEM topics so they could see that inherent connection between art and science. This is one example of that, where Tonya Osborne, an Alaska Native artist, student, and researcher, shared her jewelry making business alongside her research on St. Lawrence Island. And you can see the art as well as the science, math, and engineering that go into that process. Lastly, during our post-webinar phase, we would debrief as a team and make sure we asked ourselves what we could improve on for next time. We wanted to make sure we could continue improving our relationships with these communities, adapt our technology to any issues that might have occurred during our webinars, and make sure to incorporate their culture. Incorporating Alaska Native culture into environmental science education is really important because it can uplift Alaska Native students and show them that they've always had the inherent skills to succeed in STEM topics. This can fight against the harmful narrative that only focuses on some disparities experienced by Native peoples, and instead show the incredible intersection of art and science in Alaska Native culture. Thank you so much. I would like to thank a lot of people. My site supervisor and the rest of my team at NOAA Alaska, my faculty advisor, all of our interviewees, my co-intern who's in the crowd, and my professor, Sean, of course, and my friends and family for getting me to graduation.
Okay, questions for Emma?
Yeah.
What was the biggest challenge you faced during this internship?
That's a great question. So the biggest challenge that our team faced was, I would say, two different things. First off, this is only the second season of NOAA Live Alaska. It's based off of NOAA's broader webinar series, NOAA Live. And so that was really challenging just because not all of the kinks of funding and grants and staffing and scheduling and figuring out even enough people to really run a webinar series were worked out yet. So that's still something we're trying to work on. And then also another challenge I would say is that my internship was all remote. So it was harder to build those relationships, but because of our team's pre-existing relationships with these communities, it was a lot easier for me to be able to join them in that. Yeah.
So how do you strike a balance between sort of teaching Western environmental science and respecting sort of their local and traditional knowledge, and sort of during those webinars to allow that sort of exchange of ideas?
Yeah, definitely. So for this season of our webinars, we focused on having community speakers, so it was more heavily leaning on the traditional knowledge, but there's always a balance, especially since we're coming from a Western education program. And so one way to do that is to, one, have community speakers, so make sure that people from the community, they're the best people to know what their community needs to hear and what they want to hear, so that was really important. And also bringing in native language alongside maybe some other Western topics, and yeah, making sure that we're going in and asking what the community wants and needs, because sometimes they don't need us to tell them about Western science, and that is also great. And so we need to be able to adapt to what those communities need and give that to them. Yeah.
What was your biggest lesson or takeaway from this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say my biggest takeaway was seeing all the different ways that our cultures empower us to use science, technology, engineering, and math every day. I was not someone who those topics came easily to, and so it was really great to be able to see the different ways that I practice those every day because of my culture or my lifestyle, and then see that in other people as well. Yeah.
In what context are the students watching these webinars? Are they in school or is it for fun?
Yeah, so our target audience was kids in grades 2 through 8. So because of that, we tried to figure out a time that would work for all of them, which is usually school time. And then also in these more remote communities, there is usually pretty reliable in-school or in community center internet and computers, but not as much at home. So it was important that we were able to present these webinars at a time when the kids would be in school. And so depending on what community we were trying to reach out to for each specific topic, we would make sure that the time we had our webinars coincided with the time when they would be in class and not like at lunch or having a day off, or if it was during any kind of like big weeks off for students in Alaska.
Great. Thank you so much.